the Bible's first murderer, killed his brother Abel, his rejected offering sparking a curse that marked humanity's violent dawn. From the book of Genesis, his tale of envy and exile raises hard questions. Was his sin inevitable, a flaw etched into human nature, or a choice shaped by divine rejection? The Talmud and apocryphal texts weave stories of his wandering life and tragic end, while skeptics see him as a symbol of humanity's struggle with failure. Subscribe and join us as we explore this primal tragedy, where faith meets moral collapse, and see how Cain's shadow still shapes our understanding of guilt, redemption, and the roots of violence. Long before serial killers made headlines and criminologists studied the psychology of murder, there was Cain, humanity's first killer, whose story in Genesis chapter 4 launched 4 millennia of theological debate, cultural mythology, and uncomfortable questions about human nature itself. His crime wasn't theft or deception, it was fratricide. The deliberate murder of his own brother Abel in a field outside Eden, making him not just history's first murderer, but the architect of humanity's violent legacy. Yet for all the attention his story receives, most people know only the surface details. Jealous brother kills righteous brother, gets cursed by God, wanders the earth with some mysterious mark. But scratch beneath that Sunday school summary, and you'll find a figure far more complex and disturbing than popular understanding suggests. Cain appears not just in Hebrew scripture, but across Jewish midrash, Christian theology, Islamic tradition, medieval folklore, and modern literature, each culture wrestling with the same fundamental questions his story raises. Was he born evil or made that way? Was his crime inevitable, written into his nature from birth? Or was it the tragic result of divine favoritism and human failure? And perhaps most unsettling of all, what does his story reveal about the capacity for violence that lurks within every human heart? The scene in Genesis is deceptively simple. 2 brothers bring offerings to God. One is accepted, the other rejected. The rejected brother kills the accepted one. End of story. Except it's not the end. It's the beginning of everything that follows in human history. Cain's murder of Abel wasn't a crime of passion or an accident gone wrong. According to the text, God actually warned Cain beforehand that sin was crouching at his door, ready to devour him if he didn't master it. Cain had a choice. He chose violence. But here's what makes his story so enduringly disturbing. He was the firstborn human, the very first child ever born on earth, the prototype of humanity, and his defining act was murder. What's remarkable about Cain isn't just that he appears in the Hebrew Bible, but how his story has been adopted, adapted, and reinterpreted across virtually every major religious and cultural tradition. Jewish scholars in the Talmud transformed him into a horned wanderer who lived for centuries, eventually killed by his own descendant Lamech in a case of mistaken identity. Christians saw him as the first embodiment of evil triumphing over righteousness, a precursor to all future persecution of the faithful. Muslims called him Qabil and focused on his overwhelming guilt and shame after the murder, with a crow teaching him how to bury his brother's body. Medieval folklore placed him on the moon, eternally carrying bundles of thorns. Renaissance artists painted his rage and anguish. Modern writers have turned him into everything from a vampire progenitor to a symbol of urban alienation. Why does his story refuse to stay contained within its original context? Because every culture recognizes something uncomfortably familiar in Cain's trajectory, from favoritism to jealousy to violence. His story isn't just ancient history, it's a mirror reflecting humanity's darkest impulses across every generation. The story begins where all human stories begin, with birth, hope, and the naive assumption that things will work out differently this time. Genesis chapter 4 opens with what should have been a moment of pure joy. Adam knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain. Her first words as a new mother reveal everything about her expectations. "I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord." The Hebrew word she uses, qanah, means to acquire or obtain. as if this child were God's gift to compensate for their expulsion from Eden. But Eve's declaration carries an ominous undertone that translators have debated for centuries. Some render her words as, "I have gotten a man, the Lord," suggesting she believed her firstborn might be the promised seed who would crush the serpent's head. If so, her hopes would prove tragically misplaced. Cain arrived first, followed by his brother Abel. From the beginning, their lives diverged along paths that would define not just their individual fates, but the trajectory of human civilization itself. Cain became a worker of the ground, a farmer, like his father Adam had been in Eden before the fall. He understood soil, seasons, and the back-breaking labor required to coax crops from cursed earth. This wasn't gardening in paradise. This was agriculture under divine judgment, where thorns and thistles competed with every seed he planted. Abel chose a different path. He became a keeper of sheep, humanity's first shepherd. While Cain fought against the ground's rebellion, Abel worked with living creatures, tending flocks that could multiply and move, that could provide milk, wool, and meat without the constant battle against cursed soil. These weren't just career choices. They represented two fundamentally different approaches to survival in a fallen world. Cain sought to master the earth through cultivation and control. Abel chose stewardship of living creatures through care and protection. Then came the moment that would define both brothers forever. In the course of time, the Hebrew suggests, after a considerable period, not immediately, both brothers brought offerings to the Lord. Cain brought from the fruit of the ground, a phrase that sounds neutral until you realize what it doesn't say. It doesn't say he brought the first fruits. It doesn't say he brought the best, just some fruit from his harvest. Abel, by contrast, brought the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions, explicitly the best he had to offer. The text emphasizes both quality and intention, first and finest. The Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. The Hebrew word for regard suggests more than mere acceptance. It implies divine pleasure, even delight. God wasn't just receiving these offerings. He was evaluating the hearts behind them. What happened next reveals something crucial about both divine character and human nature. God didn't simply reject Cain and move on. He approached the angry, fallen-faced brother with a question and a warning that would echo through human history. Why are you angry, and why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. This passage contains some of the most psychologically penetrating language in all of Scripture. God acknowledges Cain's emotional state without condemning it, offers hope for future acceptance, and provides a stark warning about the nature of temptation itself. Sin, God warns, is like a predatory animal crouching at the door, waiting for the moment of weakness when it can pounce. But, and this is crucial, it can be mastered. The same Hebrew word used for Adam's dominion over creation is used here for Cain's potential dominion over sin. Cain had a choice. The outcome wasn't predetermined. Even after his offering was rejected, redemption remained possible. But Cain chose differently. Genesis chapter 4 verse 8 contains one of the most chilling sequences in all of Scripture. Cain spoke to Abel his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. The Hebrew text of what Cain said to Abel is missing, literally. Most translations add something like, "Let us go out to the field," but the original simply says, Cain spoke to Abel his brother, and then moves directly to the murder. That blank space where Cain's words should be has haunted interpreters for millennia. What did he say? Was it a lie to lure Abel away? A confession of his rage? A final plea for understanding? We'll never know, but we know the result. In a field away from their parents' eyes, Cain committed the first murder in human history. Brother killed brother. Blood soaked into ground that had never before tasted human death. God's response mirrors his approach to Adam and Eve after their sin. Not immediate judgment, but a question that offered opportunity for confession and repentance. "Where is Abel your brother?" Cain's answer reveals how far he had fallen from the moment of divine warning. "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" This wasn't just a lie. It was a fundamental rejection of human responsibility, community, and the very concept of family obligation. In asking if he was his brother's keeper, Cain was rejecting the foundational principle that humans are interconnected, that we have obligations to each other, that love and care define what it means to be human. God's response was swift and terrible. "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground." The Hebrew suggests not just blood, but bloods, plural, as if Abel's spilled blood represented not just his life, but all the lives he would never father, all the descendants who would never exist because of Cain's choice. Murder, God revealed, kills not just the victim, but the future itself. Names in the ancient world weren't just labels, they were prophecies, declarations, and sometimes curses wrapped in syllables. When Eve named her firstborn Cain, she was making a statement about divine providence, human hope, and the nature of creation itself. But like so many declarations in Genesis, her words carried meanings she couldn't have anticipated. The name Cain derives from the Hebrew root kuanah, which means to get, to acquire, or to obtain. When Eve declared, "I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord," she was literally naming her son after the act of acquisition itself. But this simple etymology opens into layers of meaning that have fascinated scholars for centuries. In Hebrew, kana doesn't just mean passive acquisition. It implies active creation, skilled craftsmanship, and divine involvement. When Genesis says God created the heavens and the earth, it uses quana. When Proverbs describes divine wisdom as being acquired from the beginning, it uses quana. Eve's choice of name suggested she saw Cain not just as a child received, but as a work of divine artistry, a co-creation between herself and God. But there's another layer. The Hebrew consonants of Cain's name, ku, o-f, yod, nun, can also relate to the word for smith or metalworker. This connection becomes eerily prophetic when we later discover that Cain's descendant, Tubal-Cain, becomes the first forger of bronze and iron tools. The name that began with creation and acquisition would eventually be associated with the instruments of both construction and destruction. Eve's full statement, "I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord," contains linguistic ambiguities that have sparked theological debate for millennia. The Hebrew phrase et yhwh can be translated multiple ways, each carrying different implications. The traditional reading suggests Eve believed God assisted in the creation of her child, a reasonable interpretation for the first woman to give birth. But some ancient interpreters read the phrase as, "I have gotten a man, even the Lord," suggesting Eve believed she had given birth to the promised seed who would defeat the serpent, perhaps even to a divine being himself. If this interpretation is correct, Eve's naming of Cain reveals not just hope, but messianic expectation. She may have believed her firstborn was the answer to humanity's fall, the one who would restore what had been lost in Eden. The tragic irony, of course, is that instead of bringing redemption, Cain would introduce murder to the world. The concept of kana, acquisition, becomes central to understanding Cain's character and fate. His name links him forever to the idea of getting, obtaining, taking possession. But what happens when someone named acquisition can't acquire what he most desires, divine approval? Cain's entire story becomes a meditation on the difference between earning and receiving, between merit and grace. His name suggests he was meant to be someone who obtains things through effort and skill. Yet the one thing he needed most, God's acceptance, couldn't be acquired through agricultural excellence or personal striving. The irony deepens when we realize that after the murder, Cain loses his ability to acquire anything from the ground. The man whose name means to get becomes someone from whom the earth withholds its produce. His identity and his curse become perfectly, terribly aligned. Some later Jewish traditions pushed Cain's etymology into even more mysterious territory. Certain midrashic sources suggest Eve's declaration wasn't about acquiring a child with God's help, but about acquiring a child from a divine being, specifically the angel Samael, sometimes identified with Satan himself. In these traditions, Cain's name doesn't just mean acquired, it means acquired from the wrong source. His violence and evil nature aren't seen as human failures, but as the inevitable result of supernatural corruption from the beginning. While these interpretations aren't found in canonical scripture, they reveal how later generations struggled to explain the presence of such profound evil in humanity's first family. Perhaps most unsettling is how perfectly Cain's name predicts his story's trajectory. Named for acquisition, he becomes history's first example of what happens when humans try to acquire worth, love, and divine approval through violence and control. His name begins with Eve's hope that she had acquired something precious. It ends with Cain acquiring a curse, acquiring a mark, acquiring a reputation that would endure for 4,000 years. The child named forgetting became the man who lost everything: his brother, his home, his ability to cultivate the ground, his place in the human community. Yet even in his curse, the theme of acquisition continues. God gives him a mark of protection, ensuring that despite his crime, his life would be preserved. Even in judgment, Cain acquires something: divine mercy mixed with justice, protection wrapped in punishment. The name Eve spoke in hope became a word that would forever be associated with humanity's capacity for both creation and destruction, acquisition and loss, the blessing and curse of human agency itself. When God pronounced judgment on Cain, he wasn't just punishing a crime, God house. He was establishing principles of divine justice that would echo through human history. The curse that followed Abel's murder became humanity's first encounter with the complex relationship between sin, consequence, and mercy. God's curse came in 3 devastating parts, each targeting a fundamental aspect of Cain's identity and future. First, the ground itself would rebel against him. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. This wasn't just agricultural failure, it was cosmic rejection. The earth that had drunk Abel's blood would refuse to cooperate with his murderer. Cain, the farmer, would become Cain, the failed farmer, unable to practice the very skill that had defined his identity. The Hebrew suggests something more profound than mere crop failure. The ground would actively resist Cain's efforts, as if creation itself had turned against him. Where other farmers might struggle with drought or poor soil, Cain would face something unprecedented: earth that remembered his crime and responded with supernatural barrenness. Second, he would become a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. The Hebrew words na and nod, fugitive and wanderer, suggest constant, restless motion without purpose or destination. Cain wouldn't just be homeless, he would be psychologically incapable of settling anywhere permanently. The curse would drive him forward endlessly, seeking rest he could never find. But the third element of the curse reveals God's character as much as Cain's fate. Despite the severity of his crime, Cain would not be executed. Instead, he would live, carrying his guilt, experiencing his consequences, but preserved from the ultimate penalty his actions deserved. Cain's reaction to the curse reveals both his selfishness and his terror. My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. His primary concern wasn't grief over Abel's death or remorse for his crime, but fear for his own survival. He understood immediately that as history's first murderer, he would become a target for vengeance from other members of his family or any humans they might encounter. God's response was unexpected and has puzzled interpreters for centuries. Not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. Then the text states simply, "And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who found him should attack him." What was this mark? The Hebrew word oath simply means sign or mark. It could be anything from a physical alteration to a supernatural aura. The text offers no description, leaving 4,000 years of interpreters to speculate wildly about its nature and appearance. Early Jewish tradition suggested the mark was divine light radiating from Cain's face, ironically similar to the glow that would later emanate from Moses after encountering God. Others proposed it was a letter from God's name inscribed on his forehead, making him recognizable and protected wherever he traveled. More ominous interpretations emerged over time. Some traditions describe the mark as a horn growing from Cain's forehead, a detail that would later contribute to his accidental death when his descendant Lamech mistook him for an animal while hunting. Medieval Christian art often depicted Cain with dark skin, an interpretation that would later be tragically misused to justify slavery and racial discrimination. But perhaps the most psychologically compelling interpretation suggests the mark was a tremor, an uncontrollable shaking that would identify Cain wherever he went. This reading connects to the Hebrew word nad wanderer, which can also suggest trembling or shaking. Cain would carry his crime in his very body, a constant physical reminder of what he had done. The mark presents a theological paradox that has challenged interpreters across cultures and centuries. Was it primarily protective or punitive? Was God showing mercy to a murderer or ensuring his crime would be visible for all eternity? The text suggests both simultaneously. The mark protected Cain from vigilante justice while marking him as history's first killer. It preserved his life while ensuring he could never escape the consequences of his actions. Wherever he went, whatever new community he encountered, the mark would identify him as someone who had crossed a line no human had crossed before. This dual nature, protection and identification, mercy and justice, one ride, established a pattern of divine response to human sin that would recur throughout Scripture. God's justice is real, but it's tempered by mercy. Consequences are inevitable, but they're designed for preservation, not destruction. The curse on Cain raised immediate questions about his descendants. If the ground wouldn't yield to him, how would his children survive? If he was marked as a murderer, what would that mean for his lineage? Genesis provides some answers in the genealogy that follows. Cain's descendants would become innovators and creators, builders of the first city, inventors of musical instruments, pioneers of metallurgy. They would overcome their ancestors' agricultural curse through technology and urbanization. But their innovations came with moral ambiguity. The same line that produced beautiful music also produced Lamech, who would boast about killing a man for merely wounding him. The descendants of the first murderer would amplify both human creativity and human violence. According to later tradition, Cain's entire lineage perished in the flood of Noah's time. The curse that began with one man's choice would end with divine judgment on the civilization his descendants built. Yet even here, the pattern of justice tempered by mercy continued. Noah's family survived to begin humanity's story again. Cain's mark has become one of the most debated symbols in human history, raising questions that go far beyond its physical appearance. What does it mean for divine justice to include protection for the guilty? How do we balance mercy with accountability? What happens when the consequences of our actions become part of our permanent identity? The mark of Cain suggests that some choices leave permanent scars, not just on others, but on ourselves. Yet even those scars can become instruments of divine purpose, protecting while they identify, preserving while they punish. In Cain's story, we see both humanity's capacity for evil and God's determination to work even through our worst failures toward purposes we cannot foresee. After the curse, after the mark, after becoming history's first exile, Cain did something that reveals both human resilience and the complexity of divine judgment. FD done. He built a family. But not just any family. A lineage that would pioneer human civilization while carrying forward the violent legacy of their ancestor. Before we can understand Cain's descendants, we need to address the question that has puzzled readers for millennia. Where did Cain find a wife? If Adam and Eve were the first humans, and Cain had just killed his only mentioned brother, who exactly was available for marriage? Genesis chapter 5 provides the answer that most interpreters have accepted. Adam and Eve had many children beyond Cain and Abel. The text specifically mentions that Adam had other sons and daughters during his 930 years of life. Early marriage between siblings wasn't just acceptable in the primordial world, it was genetically necessary for human survival. Jewish tradition gives Cain's wife a name, Awan, described as his sister. Later Midrashic sources suggest that each of the brothers was actually born with a twin sister, and that part of their conflict arose from disputes over which brother would marry which sister. While these details aren't found in canonical scripture, they reflect ancient attempts to fill in the narrative gaps that Genesis leaves unexplored. Cain's response to his curse was remarkable in its audacity. God had condemned him to be a wanderer, unable to settle anywhere permanently. Cain's solution? Build a city and name it after his son. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. When Cain built a city, he called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. This wasn't just defiance of divine judgment, it was the founding of human civilization itself. The first murderer became the first urban planner, creating humanity's first permanent settlement. The irony is profound. God had cursed Cain to be a restless wanderer, but Cain used his intelligence and determination to create a place where wanderers could stop wandering. In building a city, he was attempting to overcome his curse through human ingenuity and communal organization. But there's a darker interpretation. Some scholars suggest that Cain's city building represented a rejection of dependence on God's provision. Instead of trusting divine mercy and accepting his punishment, Cain chose to create his own security through walls, gates, and human cooperation. The city became a monument to human self-sufficiency in the face of divine displeasure. Cain's descendants became the pioneers of human technology and culture, though their innovations carried the moral ambiguity of their ancestors' legacy. The genealogy in Genesis chapter 4 reads like a catalog of human firsts. Jabal became the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock, the founder of nomadic pastoralism. His brother Jubal was the father of all those who play the lyre and pipe, humanity's first musician, the inventor of instrumental music. Their half-brother Tubal-Cain was the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron, the world's first metallurgist, the man who learned to shape metal into tools and weapons. His sister Naamah is mentioned without explanation, though later traditions would make her either a temptress or a preserver of ancient songs. What's striking about this lineage is how it balances creation and destruction. Jabal's pastoralism provided food and clothing. Jabal's music brought beauty and joy. But Tubal, Cain's metallurgy created both agricultural tools and weapons of war. The same hands that forged plowshares could forge swords. Cain's city represented more than just architecture. It embodied a worldview that would compete with divine authority throughout human history. Where God had established a garden as humanity's original home, emphasizing dependence on divine provision and harmony with creation, Cain's city emphasized human achievement and independence from natural limitations. The city became a place where humans could control their environment, protect themselves from threats, and accumulate resources beyond what they could carry as wanderers. It was humanity's first attempt to create security through collective effort rather than divine relationship. But cities also concentrate human sin, along with human achievement. The same walls that protect can also trap. The same cooperation that enables great works can also enable great evils. Cain's city became the model for all future human attempts to build heaven on earth through our own efforts. This pattern would repeat throughout Scripture. From Babel to Babylon, from Sodom to Rome, cities would represent both human potential and human corruption, innovation and oppression, community and alienation. The moral trajectory of Cain's line reaches its climax with Lamech, Cain's great-great-great-grandson, who appears to have inherited and amplified his ancestors' violent tendencies. Lamech married 2 wives, Adah and Zillah, becoming the first recorded polygamist. But more significantly, he composed what may be humanity's first poem, a boastful song about revenge that reveals how far his family had fallen from any concept of proportional justice. Adah and Zillah, hear my voice, you wives of Lamech, listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. Where Cain had killed in anger and jealousy, Lamech killed for minor offenses. Where God had promised sevenfold vengeance for anyone who harmed Cain, Lamech claimed 77-fold vengeance for anyone who merely touched him. The violence that began with one brother's jealousy had escalated into a philosophy of unlimited retaliation. According to most biblical chronologies, Cain's entire lineage perished in the flood of Noah's time. The innovative, violent, self-sufficient civilization they had built was swept away by divine judgment, leaving only Noah's family to restart human history. This ending suggests that human achievement without divine relationship ultimately leads to destruction. Cain's descendants had solved many practical problems. They had music, metallurgy, cities, and livestock management. But they had never solved the fundamental problem that began with their ancestor, the human tendency toward violence and self-justification. Yet their innovations survived even if they didn't. After the flood, humans would again build cities, play music, work with metal, and tend livestock. The knowledge they had gained was preserved, but hopefully tempered by the recognition that human cleverness alone cannot overcome human sinfulness. Cain's legacy thus becomes both warning and promise, an inips, a demonstration of incredible human potential, coupled with the sobering reminder that our greatest achievements mean nothing if they're built on foundations of violence and pride. Why did Cain kill Abel? It's perhaps the most psychologically complex question in all of Scripture, and one that has generated wildly different answers across 4 millennia of interpretation. The biblical text provides the framework, but leaves crucial gaps that later traditions have attempted to fill with explanations ranging from theological to psychological to disturbingly modern. Genesis chapter 4 gives us the sequence of events, but leaves the deeper motivations frustratingly unclear. God accepted Abel's offering, but rejected Cain's. Cain became angry. God warned him about sin crouching at his door. Then Cain killed Abel. But why was Cain's offering rejected in the first place? The text offers tantalizing clues without definitive answers. Abel brought the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions, explicitly the best he had. Cain brought from the fruit of the ground, language that suggests adequacy rather than excellence. Some interpreters focus on the quality of the offerings. Abel gave his best. Cain gave whatever was convenient. This reading suggests that God's rejection was based on the heart attitude behind the gift rather than the gift itself. It wasn't that agricultural offerings were inherently inferior to animal sacrifices, but that Cain's offering reflected a casual, half-hearted approach to worship. Others argue that the issue was prophetic rather than qualitative. Abel's bloody sacrifice prefigured the ultimate sacrifice of Christ, while Cain's bloodless offering represented human attempts to approach God through works rather than through substitutionary atonement. In this interpretation, God's rejection of Cain's offering was less about Cain's heart and more about divine revelation of how atonement must ultimately work. But perhaps the most psychologically compelling interpretation is that God's choice was simply sovereign, not based on merit at all, but on divine prerogative. This reading emphasizes that God's favor cannot be earned through human effort, no matter how sincere. Cain's rage, then, wasn't just about agricultural failure, but about the fundamental unfairness of a universe where divine blessing seems arbitrary. Jewish tradition, particularly in the Midrashic literature, provides a dramatically different explanation for the murder, AG1, one that transforms the story from theological drama to sexual rivalry. According to several Midrashic sources, each brother was born with a twin sister. Cain's twin was named Aklima, described as exceptionally beautiful. Abel's twin was less attractive. The brothers were expected to marry each other's twins to avoid genetic problems, but Cain refused to give up Aklima and demanded to marry his own beautiful sister instead. In this version, their competing offerings to God were actually attempts to win divine approval for their preferred marriage arrangements. When God accepted Abel's offering, it meant Abel would get to marry the beautiful Aklima, while Cain would be stuck with Abel's plainer twin sister, This interpretation transforms Cain's motivation from religious jealousy to sexual competition. He didn't kill Abel because he was angry at God, but because he couldn't bear the thought of his brother possessing the woman he desired. The murder becomes a crime of passion rather than theological rebellion. While this explanation isn't found in canonical scripture, it reflects ancient recognition that many conflicts between brothers have less to do with spiritual issues and more to do with competition for resources, status, and sexual partners. The Midrashic tradition was attempting to explain why Cain's anger was so intense that it led to murder. Modern psychological interpretation offers yet another lens for understanding Cain's motivation, one that focuses on shame, dynamics, and narcissistic injury rather than theological or sexual competition. In this reading, Cain's identity was built around being the successful farmer, the firstborn, the one who could provide for his family through skill and hard work. When God rejected his offering, it wasn't just a ritual failure. It was a fundamental attack on his sense of self-worth and competence. Abel's acceptance made the injury worse because it proved that divine approval was possible. If both offerings had been rejected, Cain might have concluded that God was simply impossible to please. But Abel's success demonstrated that the problem wasn't with God's standards, but with Cain himself. The psychological term narcissistic rage describes the intense fury that results when someone's grandiose self-image is threatened by reality. Cain had likely built his identity around being the responsible older brother, the reliable provider, the one who understood how to make things grow. Abel's acceptance by God shattered that self-concept and revealed Cain as ordinary, replaceable, not special. Unable to process this narcissistic injury, Cain redirected his rage from God, who was too powerful to attack, to Abel, who was vulnerable. By killing Abel, Cain could eliminate the evidence of his own inadequacy while reasserting his dominance as the surviving brother. This interpretation explains why Cain's response to God's question, "Where is Abel?" was so defensive and hostile. "Am I my brother's keeper?" wasn't just a lie. It was an aggressive rejection of responsibility that revealed someone whose shame had hardened into defiant self-justification. Perhaps the most sobering aspect of Cain's story is how it establishes patterns that would repeat throughout human history. His motivation, whatever its specific details, represents humanity's first encounter with several destructive dynamics that continue to drive conflict today. The pattern of sibling rivalry appears again and again in Genesis. Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau, Joseph and his brothers. Each case involves competition for parental or divine favor, and each reveals how quickly family bonds can dissolve under the pressure of perceived inequality. The pattern of religious violence also begins with Cain. Throughout history, some of humanity's worst atrocities have been committed by people who believed they were defending divine truth or earning divine approval. Cain's murder of Abel becomes the prototype for every subsequent case of religious persecution, sectarian violence, and holy war. Most fundamentally, Cain's story reveals the human tendency to blame others for problems that originate within ourselves. Rather than examining his own heart, his own offering, his own relationship with God, Cain found it easier to eliminate the person whose success highlighted his failure. What makes Cain's story so enduringly relevant is how easily we can recognize his motivations in contemporary conflicts: road rage, workplace violence, domestic abuse, terrorism. All involve people who feel they've been treated unfairly and choose to respond with disproportionate violence against those they perceive as threats to their dignity or security. Cain's question, "Am I my brother's keeper?" has become humanity's perpetual moral challenge. Every time we ignore homelessness, dismiss systemic injustice, or prioritize our own comfort over others' suffering, we're essentially asking the same question Cain asked. Why should someone else's welfare be my responsibility? The tragedy of Cain's story isn't just that he committed murder, but that he chose the path of violence when other responses were available. God had explicitly told him that acceptance was still possible if he did well. Repentance, renewed effort, honest self-examination, all were options. But Cain chose the one option that guaranteed his isolation and condemnation. In the end, Cain's motivations may be less important than his choice. Whether driven by religious frustration, sexual jealousy, or narcissistic rage, he faced the same decision every human faces when confronted with failure, rejection, or perceived unfairness. Respond with growth or respond with violence. Cain chose violence and became history's first lesson in how quickly human dignity can collapse into human monstrosity. When Jewish scholars encountered the spare narrative of Cain in Genesis, they saw not a complete story, but a skeleton waiting for flesh. The Midrashic tradition, NSAM, those ancient rabbinic interpretations that filled gaps in biblical texts, transformed Cain from a simple biblical villain into a complex figure whose life story spanned centuries and whose death became as dramatic as his crime. According to Talmudic calculations, Cain was 15 years old when he murdered Abel, barely more than a child when he committed history's first homicide. This detail adds psychological complexity to the story, suggesting that humanity's introduction to violence came not from a mature adult's calculated evil, but from an adolescent's inability to process rejection and jealousy. The rabbinic sources provide Cain with a full family structure that Genesis only hints at. He married his sister Owan and had 4 sons, Enoch, Olad, Lizpha, and Phosel, along with 2 daughters whose names vary between sources. This wasn't just genealogical bookkeeping. It was an attempt to understand how Cain's violent legacy would be transmitted through generations. But the most striking element of the Midrashic expansion is its insistence that Cain lived for centuries, carrying his mark and his guilt across vast spans of time. Some sources suggest he lived until the generation of Noah, making him a living reminder of humanity's first sin as civilization developed around him. Perhaps the most vivid Midrashic addition to Cain's story is the detail of his horn. According to several sources, Cain's mark wasn't a letter or a tremor, but an actual horn growing from his forehead, a physical deformity that marked him as unmistakably as any brand. This horn served multiple narrative purposes. It made Cain immediately recognizable wherever he traveled, ensuring that the divine protection would be honored. It also transformed him into something less than fully human, a creature whose appearance reflected his moral corruption. The horn detail becomes crucial to understanding Cain's death, which the Midrash describes in elaborate detail. According to Talmudic tradition, Cain was eventually killed by his own descendant Lamech in a case of tragic mistaken identity. The story goes that Lamech, who was blind, went hunting guided by his young son Tubal-Cain. When the boy spotted movement in the bushes and identified what he thought was a horned beast, Lamech shot an arrow and killed the creature. Only when they approached the body did they discover it was actually Cain, whose horn had made him appear animal-like from a distance. Lamech's killing of Cain represents more than just ironic coincidence in the Midrashic imagination. It's divine justice working through family bloodlines. The violence that began with Cain would end with Cain, but administered by his own descendant. The weapon used was significant too. Lamech killed Cain with the same type of implement, a stone, according to some versions, that Cain had used to kill Abel. This death story resolves several theological problems that the sparse biblical account leaves hanging. How did Cain's line finally end? How was justice served for Abel's murder? How did God's promise of 7-fold vengeance play out? The Midrashic answer is that divine justice works slowly but inevitably, using human choices and family dynamics to accomplish its purposes. Lamech's reaction to discovering he had killed his ancestor adds another layer to the story. Realizing what he had done, Lamech clapped his hands together in shock, accidentally killing his young guide Tubal-Cain in the process. This second death explains Lamech's boastful poem in Genesis chapter 4. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. The man was Cain. The young man was Tubal-Cain. The Midrashic elaboration serves several theological purposes beyond mere storytelling. By making Cain live for centuries, the tradition emphasizes that divine justice operates on timescales far longer than human patience typically endures. Cain's extended life becomes a testament to both divine mercy, end quote, he was preserved despite his crime, end quote, and divine memory, his punishment was never forgotten or abbreviated. The detail of his horn transforms the mark from mysterious divine action to visible divine judgment. It makes concrete what Genesis leaves abstract, turning theological concept into physical reality. But it also raises uncomfortable questions about divine justice. Was making Cain visibly deformed merciful protection or cruel punishment? The Midrash suggests it was both simultaneously. The involvement of family members in Cain's eventual death speaks to rabbinic understanding of how sin affects not just individuals, but entire bloodlines. Violence begets violence, the tradition suggests, and families that begin with murder often end with murder. Yet even this violent ending serves divine purposes. Wick. It brings closure to a story that might otherwise stretch on indefinitely. What emerges from the Midrashic expansions is a psychologically complex portrait of Cain as someone trapped between divine mercy and justice, preserved but punished, protected but marked. Living for centuries with the memory of his crime, carrying visible evidence of his guilt, watching his descendants develop the violent tendencies he had introduced to the world, this, Cain, becomes a figure of tragic rather than simple evil. The tradition emphasizes his isolation and wandering, but also his productivity. Even cursed, even marked, even guilty of the first murder, Cain remained capable of building cities, raising families, and contributing to human civilization. The Midrash refuses to make him simply a monster. He remains recognizably human, which makes his story both more tragic and more relevant. Lamech's accidental killing of Cain provides narrative closure that the biblical account lacks, but it also establishes a pattern of divine justice that operates through human agency rather than supernatural intervention. God doesn't strike Cain down with lightning. Instead, he allows human choices and family dynamics to work out the consequences of sin over generations. This approach to divine justice would become characteristic of how the Jewish tradition understood God's interaction with human history. Rather than constant miraculous intervention, God typically works through natural processes, human decisions, and long-term consequences to accomplish his purposes. Cain's death becomes a model for how divine justice operates, and, slowly, through secondary causes, but inexorably. The Midrashic expansion of Cain's story thus transforms a simple tale of sibling rivalry into a complex meditation on justice, mercy, family, guilt, and the long-term consequences of moral choices. It takes the theological skeleton that Genesis provides and builds around it a fully realized human drama that has influenced Jewish understanding of these themes for over 2 millennia. Christianity transformed Cain from a figure of ancient history into a living symbol of spiritual warfare, making his story a lens through which to understand the cosmic battle between good and evil that defines the Christian worldview. For early Christians writing under persecution, Cain became both warning and prophecy, the first example of how evil would always seek to silence righteousness. The most influential Christian interpretation of Cain appears in the first epistle of John, which cuts through centuries of speculation to deliver a stark theological verdict. We should not be like Cain, who was of the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brother's righteous. This passage revolutionized Christian understanding of the murder by introducing a supernatural element largely absent from Genesis. Cain wasn't just a jealous brother, he was of the evil one, aligned with Satan himself in opposition to divine righteousness. Abel's murder thus becomes the first battle in a spiritual war that would culminate in the crucifixion of Christ. The Johannine interpretation also establishes a pattern of persecution that would resonate powerfully with early Christians facing Roman opposition. Just as Cain killed Abel because Abel's righteousness exposed his own evil, so the world would always seek to destroy those whose lives reflected divine truth. Every Christian martyr became, in this framework, another Abel, killed not for political or social reasons, but because righteousness inherently threatens those who choose darkness. This reading transforms Cain from an individual case study in human failure into a type, a representation of everyone who opposes God's people throughout history. Kings who persecuted Christians, philosophers who attacked the faith, even fellow believers who betrayed their brethren, all were seen as following in Cain's footsteps. Christian typology, SOP, the practice of seeing Old Testament figures as prefiguring New Testament realities, found rich material in Cain's story. Augustine and other church fathers developed elaborate parallels between Cain and various aspects of Christian theology. Cain's rejection by God prefigured the rejection of the Jewish nation in favor of the Gentile church. Just as Abel's sacrifice was accepted while Cain's was refused, so the new covenant would be accepted while the old covenant would be superseded. This interpretation, while theologically problematic from modern perspectives, shaped Christian understanding of their relationship to Judaism for centuries. The mark of Cain was interpreted as a type of the hardening that comes upon those who persistently reject divine grace. Medieval theologians saw in Cain's inability to settle anywhere a picture of the restless heart that can find no peace apart from God. His founding of the first city represented humanity's futile attempt to create security and meaning through human achievement rather than divine relationship. Even Cain's preservation, despite his crime, became theologically significant. Early Christians saw this as evidence of God's patience with sinners and his desire for repentance rather than destruction. Cain's long life, after his crime, demonstrated that divine mercy extends even to the worst offenders, offering hope for conversion even to Christianity's fiercest opponents. Perhaps the most tragic chapter in Christian interpretation of Cain involves the misuse of his story to justify racial oppression and slavery. Beginning in medieval times and persisting well into the modern era, some Christian interpreters connected Cain's mark with dark skin, creating a theological justification for treating people of African descent as cursed descendants of the first murderer. This interpretation was often combined with the separate biblical account of Noah's curse on his son Ham, creating a compound theological argument that black skin represented divine punishment for ancient sins. The fact that God intended Cain's mark as protection rather than punishment was conveniently ignored in service of economic and social systems that benefited from racial hierarchy. The Mormon tradition, established in the 19th century, incorporated this interpretation into its foundational theology, teaching that dark skin was indeed the mark of Cain and that people of African descent were therefore excluded from full participation in religious life. While this teaching was officially disavowed by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 1978, it demonstrates how deeply the racialization of Cain's story had penetrated American Christian thought. These interpretations represent a profound perversion of Cain's story, transforming an account of individual moral failure into a justification for systematic oppression. They reveal how biblical narratives can be twisted to serve human prejudices rather than divine truth, and they stand as warnings against reading contemporary social arrangements back into ancient texts. Contemporary Christian scholarship has largely abandoned both the supersessionist and racialist interpretations of Cain's story, focusing instead on its psychological and spiritual insights. Modern Christian writers tend to emphasize Cain as a case study in how sin progresses from temptation to action to hardened self-justification. The story's emphasis on choice, SSO, God's explicit warning that Cain could still do well even after his offering was rejected, has become central to Christian understanding of human moral responsibility. Cain represents everyone who faces the decision between humility and pride, between repentance and self-justification, between accepting divine correction and lashing out at those who seem to have what we lack. Christian psychology has found in Cain's story a perfect illustration of how unprocessed shame can transform into rage and violence. His inability to accept responsibility for his crime, evidenced in his sarcastic question, "Am I my brother's keeper?" demonstrates the hardening process that begins when we refuse to acknowledge our moral failures. The story has also become a touchstone for Christian social ethics. Jesus' commandment to love your enemies can be seen as a direct response to the Cain mentality that views others as competitors to be eliminated rather than neighbors to be served. Christian teachings on forgiveness, reconciliation, and restorative justice all stand in explicit opposition to the retributive logic that motivated Cain's murder. Some Christian interpreters have found eschatological significance in Cain's story, seeing it as a preview of how human history will ultimately resolve. Just as Cain's line eventually perished in the flood, while Noah's family survived to restart civilization, so the final judgment will separate those who follow Cain's path of violence and self-justification from those who follow Abel's path of faithful worship. The blood of Abel crying from the ground in Genesis is explicitly referenced in Hebrews chapter 12, which contrasts it with the blood of sprinkling that speaks better things than that of Abel. Where Abel's blood cried for vengeance, Christ's blood speaks of forgiveness and reconciliation. The Christian gospel thus presents itself as the ultimate answer to the problem that began with Cain, the cycle of violence and retribution that has marked human history from its beginning. In this reading, Cain's story becomes not just a historical account, but a prophetic preview of humanity's choice between the way of violence and the way of sacrificial love. Every generation faces the same decision Cain faced, whether to respond to rejection and disappointment with humility or with violence, whether to see others as brothers to be protected or competitors to be eliminated. The Christian interpretation of Cain thus transforms his ancient crime into an ongoing spiritual and social challenge, making his story not just a tale from the past, but a mirror reflecting the moral choices that define human existence in every age. In Islamic tradition, the story of Cain, Islamic, known as Qabil, Islamic, becomes a profound meditation on guilt, divine guidance, and the human capacity for both evil and redemption. While sharing the basic narrative framework with Jewish and Christian accounts, the Quranic version introduces unique elements that shift the focus from divine justice to human psychology, making Qabil's story as much about remorse and learning as about crime and punishment. The story appears in Surah Al-Ma'idah, chapter 5 of the Quran, where it serves as a cautionary tale about the consequences of envy and disobedience. The Quranic version begins with the same setup, two brothers bringing offerings to Allah, but adds psychological depth that illuminates both Qabil's motivation and his aftermath. Recite to them the truth of the story of the two sons of Adam. Behold, they each presented a sacrifice to Allah. It was accepted from one, but not from the other. Said the latter, "Be sure I will slay you." Said the former, "Allah accepts of the sacrifice of those who are righteous." This dialogue, absent from Genesis, reveals the premeditated nature of Qabil's violence, while simultaneously highlighting Abel's righteousness. Habil's response that Allah accepts only from the righteous, serves both as theological instruction and as a final appeal to his brother's conscience. The Quranic Habil continues with words that have become central to Islamic ethics. "If you do stretch your hand against me to slay me, it is not for me to stretch my hand against you to slay you. For I do fear Allah, the cherisher of the worlds. For me, I intend to let you draw on yourself my sin as well as yours, for you will be among the companions of the fire, and that is the reward of those who do wrong." Habil's declaration represents one of history's earliest articulations of principled nonviolence. Even when explicitly threatened with death, he refuses to raise his hand against his brother. This wasn't passive resignation, but active moral choice. Habil chose to risk death rather than compromise his principles. This element of the story has profound implications for Islamic ethics. It establishes that righteousness sometimes requires accepting suffering rather than inflicting it, that maintaining moral purity can be more important than preserving physical life. For Muslims facing persecution or conflict, Habil becomes a model of how to respond to violence with steadfast faith rather than retaliation. The psychological insight is equally striking. Habil recognizes that if he responds to violence with violence, he would bear both his own sin and his brother's, the sin of causing his brother to sin. This sophisticated understanding of moral responsibility suggests that how we respond to evil affects not just ourselves, but those who threaten us. After the murder, the Quranic account introduces an element found nowhere else in religious literature: divine pedagogy. Through natural observation, Allah sends a crow to show Qabil how to bury his brother's body. Then Allah sent a crow who scratched the ground to show him how to hide the shame of his brother. "Woe is me," said he. "Was I not even able to be as this crow, and to hide the shame of my brother?" Then he became full of regrets. This passage transforms Qabil from a figure of unrepentant evil into someone capable of learning and growth. The crow becomes Allah's teacher, demonstrating that divine guidance can come through the most humble means. More significantly, Qabil's reaction reveals genuine remorse and excess, not just fear of consequences, but shame at his moral failure. The word shame here doesn't refer to embarrassment, but to the profound dishonor Qabil had brought upon his brother by leaving his body exposed. In recognizing his inability to match even a crow's natural instinct to cover what should be hidden, Qabil acknowledges both his practical helplessness and his moral inadequacy. Islamic tradition sees Qabil's experience as humanity's introduction to guilt, AG, not just the consequence of wrongdoing, but the internal recognition of having violated fundamental moral principles. Before this moment, humans had experienced divine correction and punishment, but not the self-aware agony of knowing they had become something they were never meant to be. Qabil's regret after burying Habil represents a psychological breakthrough that separates him from mere criminality. Criminals often regret getting caught. Qabil regretted the act itself. This distinction becomes crucial in Islamic understanding of repentance and spiritual development. The tradition emphasizes that Qabil's education didn't end with the burial. According to various Islamic sources, he spent years wandering not just as punishment, but as a process of learning to live with conscience. His mark, in this interpretation, wasn't primarily protective but pedagogical, USI, a constant reminder of both his crime and his capacity for moral growth. The Islamic interpretation of Qabil's story carries several theological implications that distinguish it from Jewish and Christian readings. First, it emphasizes divine mercy, even in judgment. The crow's instruction suggests that Allah desires human learning and growth rather than mere punishment. Second, it establishes precedent for how divine guidance operates, not just through prophets and scriptures, but through observation of natural phenomena and reflection on moral experience. The crow becomes a sign that Allah's teaching is available everywhere for those who have eyes to see and hearts to understand. Third, it demonstrates the possibility of moral development even after the worst failures. While Qabil never fully escapes the consequences of his crime, his capacity for remorse and learning suggests that human nature, however corrupted by sin, retains the potential for recognition of truth and right. The Quran concludes Qabil's story with a verse that has become foundational to Islamic ethics. On that account, "We ordained for the children of Israel that if anyone slew a person, unless it be for murder or for spreading mischief in the land, it would be as if he slew the whole of mankind. And if anyone saved a life, it would be as if he saved the life of the whole of mankind." This universalization of Qabil's crime transforms his individual act of violence into a principle governing all human interaction. Every murder is genocide, every rescue is universal salvation. The life that Qabil took wasn't just Qabil's individual existence, but humanity's collective innocence. For Muslims, this passage establishes the absolute sanctity of human life, while acknowledging that some circumstances, legitimate justice, and defense against those who spread corruption might justify taking life. But even these exceptions carry the weight of Qabil's example, reminding believers that any taking of life is a cosmic event requiring the most serious justification. Islamic scholars have found in Qabil's story a template for understanding contemporary conflicts and moral challenges. His progression from envy through threat to violence to regret provides a psychological map that illuminates everything from family disputes to international conflicts. The story's emphasis on divine guidance through natural observation has influenced Islamic approaches to science and philosophy, suggesting that moral and spiritual truths can be discovered through careful attention to creation. The crow that taught Qabil becomes a symbol of how divine wisdom operates through secondary causes rather than only through miraculous intervention. Most fundamentally, Qabil's capacity for regret offers hope that even the worst human failures need not be final. While consequences remain, the possibility of recognition, remorse, and learning suggests that divine mercy extends even to history's first murderer, remorsing, and by implication, to all who follow in his footsteps. Beyond the canonical scriptures lies a vast library of apocryphal texts that expanded, embellished, and sometimes completely reimagined Cain's story. These works, ranging from ancient pseudepigraphic writings to medieval retellings, reveal how different communities across centuries grappled with the theological and psychological implications of humanity's first murder. The Book of Jubilees, written sometime in the 2nd century before Christ, provides one of the most detailed apocryphal accounts of Cain's life and death. This text, which retells biblical history according to a precise chronological system, gives Cain's story specific dates and dramatic details absent from Genesis. According to Jubilees, Cain lived for 730 years, a lifespan that placed him among the antediluvian patriarchs, while ensuring he died before the flood. This chronology serves theological purposes, suggesting that divine justice, while patient, eventually catches up with even the most protected sinners. The text describes Cain's death with poetic justice that would have satisfied ancient readers' sense of moral order. He was killed when his own house collapsed upon him. The detail is significant. The first city builder, the man who sought security through architecture and human construction, meets his end when his own building technology fails him. But Jubilees adds another layer to the story. Cain's death occurred by the same instrumentality he had used to kill Abel, Dallas, stone. Whether through the stone walls of his house or by being crushed under stone foundations, the text suggests that divine justice operates through ironic reversal. The weapon becomes the judgment. The innovation becomes the trap. This account influenced centuries of interpretation by establishing the principle that Cain's punishment would ultimately match his crime. The man who used physical force to silence his brother would himself be silenced by physical force. The builder would be destroyed by building. The survivor would not, finally, survive. The pseudepigraphic text known as The Life of Adam and Eve, existing in multiple versions across Latin, Greek, and Slavonic traditions, NC, provides perhaps the most psychologically compelling expansion of Cain's story through the device of prophetic dreams. According to this text, Eve experienced a disturbing dream before Abel's birth that essentially previewed the murder. In her vision, she saw Cain drinking Abel's blood directly from his brother's mouth, an image that transforms the murder from a crime of passion into something approaching vampiric consumption. This dream sequence serves multiple narrative purposes. It establishes that Abel's death was known to divine providence before his birth, suggesting that his role as victim was somehow necessary to divine plans. It also provides Eve with prophetic knowledge that she was apparently powerless to act upon, creating tragic irony around parental helplessness in the face of predetermined events. The blood-drinking imagery in Eve's dream has influenced centuries of vampire folklore and Gothic literature. The idea that Cain literally consumed his brother's life force rather than simply ending it adds elements of cannibalism and supernatural horror to what might otherwise be read as straightforward fratricide. Some versions of the text suggest that Eve's dream prompted her to suggest that the brothers lived separately, Cain as a farmer in one location, Abel as a shepherd in another. This detail explains why the brothers were alone in the field when the murder occurred, while simultaneously emphasizing that even parental wisdom and precaution cannot prevent divinely foreseen tragedies. The text known as Pseudo-Philo, or Biblical Antiquities, likely written in the 1st century after Christ, introduces a completely different motivation for Abel's murder that focuses on sexual jealousy rather than religious competition. According to this account, Cain's desire wasn't primarily for divine approval, but for Abel's wife. The text suggests that both brothers were married, but that Cain coveted his brother's spouse and saw murder as a way to claim her for himself. This interpretation transforms the story from theological drama into domestic violence, making it disturbingly contemporary. The sexual motivation theory helps explain the intensity of Cain's rage and the premeditated nature of his crime. Religious jealousy might lead to anger, but sexual jealousy often leads to murder. By introducing romantic competition, Pseudo-Philo makes Cain's psychology more recognizable to readers familiar with crimes of passion. This interpretation also provides context for understanding why Cain's punishment included inability to cultivate the ground. If his crime was motivated by desire to possess another man's wife, then his curse specifically targets his ability to possess or control anything productive. The man who tried to take what belonged to another would find that nothing would belong to him. The Ethiopian text, 1 Maccabees, distinct from the canonical books of Maccabees, provides yet another variant of Cain's story that emphasizes his role as the founder of urban civilization and the originator of technological innovation. In this tradition, Cain's curse didn't primarily affect his agriculture, but drove him to develop alternatives to farming. Unable to make crops grow, he became the inventor of weights and measures, the creator of boundary markers, and the designer of the first legal systems for property ownership. His descendants didn't just build cities, they created the entire apparatus of commercial civilization. This interpretation makes Cain simultaneously the source of human progress and human corruption. Technology, law, commerce, and urban planning all stem from his need to overcome divine punishment. Human achievement becomes tainted from its origins by being rooted in the attempt to circumvent rather than accept divine judgment. Mandaean traditions, preserved by the small religious community that still exists today in Iraq and Iran, present Cain as a figure of cosmic significance whose crime affected not just human history, but the structure of creation itself. In Mandaean mythology, Cain's murder of Abel created an imbalance in the spiritual world that continues to influence the struggle between light and darkness. These traditions often present Cain as the first being to choose darkness over light in a cosmic sense, making his crime not just moral failure, but metaphysical rebellion. His descendants become associated with all subsequent evil in human history, while Abel's spiritual legacy continues through those who choose light. Several apocryphal texts connect Cain's story to astronomical phenomena, suggesting that his crime had cosmic as well as terrestrial consequences. The Apocalypse of Moses and related texts describe how Cain's murder of Abel caused certain stars to fall from heaven and created permanent changes in the relationship between earth and sky. These traditions often place Cain himself among the constellations as a perpetual reminder of his crime. Some versions suggest he became the man in the moon, eternally visible as a warning against fraternal violence. Others connect him to specific star patterns that were understood to influence human violence and conflict. The astronomical connection serves to universalize Cain's crime beyond human history. By linking his story to celestial phenomena visible to all cultures, these traditions suggest that knowledge of his crime and its consequences was available to every human society, regardless of their access to biblical revelation. What emerges from the apocryphal traditions is a figure far more complex than the biblical Cain, someone whose crime had ramifications extending through time, space, and spiritual reality. These texts transform him from an individual case study in moral failure into a cosmic principle of violence, rebellion, and technological advancement rooted in spiritual corruption. The apocryphal traditions also reveal deep anxiety about the relationship between human progress and moral degradation. Again and again, these texts suggest that civilization's greatest achievements, cities, technology, law, commerce, originated in humanity's attempt to overcome or escape divine judgment rather than accept it. Yet even in these expanded accounts, traces of hope remain. Cain's ability to build, create, and innovate suggests that even corrupted human nature retains divine image. His preservation, despite his crime, demonstrates that divine mercy extends even to cosmic rebels. And his eventual death, whether by house collapse, mistaken identity, or other means, affirms that divine justice, however patient, ultimately prevails. These apocryphal expansions of Cain's story thus serve as theological laboratories where ancient writers explored questions that the canonical accounts left open. How does individual sin affect cosmic order? What is the relationship between technological progress and spiritual corruption? Can divine mercy coexist with divine justice? The answers they provided continue to influence how religious communities understand the relationship between human achievement and moral accountability. During the medieval period, Cain's story escaped the confines of theological treatises and biblical commentaries to become part of popular folklore, spawning legends that placed him everywhere from the surface of the moon to the battlefields of the Crusades. These folk traditions reveal how ordinary people understood Cain's significance and demonstrate the remarkable creativity with which human imagination filled the gaps in his biblical story. Perhaps the most widespread medieval folk belief about Cain was that he could be seen in the moon, eternally carrying a bundle of thorns or sticks as punishment for his crime. This tradition appears across multiple European cultures with remarkable consistency, suggesting either common origin or universal human tendency to see moral meaning in celestial phenomena. The Germanic traditions were particularly detailed in their lunar Cain legends. According to these accounts, Cain was transported to the moon immediately after his crime, where he remains visible to all humanity as a perpetual reminder of the consequences of fraternal violence. The bundle he carries was variously interpreted as thorns he had gathered on the Sabbath, making him guilty of both murder and Sabbath breaking, or as kindling he was stealing when confronted by his brother. English folklore provided its own variation, suggesting that Cain was placed in the moon not immediately after Abel's murder, but after a subsequent crime of theft. In this version, he was caught stealing a neighbor's thorn bush and condemned to carry it forever in plain sight of all humanity. This folk explanation demonstrates how medieval communities connected Cain's biblical crime to contemporary concerns about property theft and community justice. The lunar tradition served multiple social functions beyond entertainment. Parents used the visible man in the moon to teach children about the consequences of violence and theft. The story provided cosmic reinforcement for community moral standards, AMD. Cain's eternal visibility meant that no crime, however ancient, was ever forgotten or forgiven by divine justice. Astronomical knowledge wasn't required to participate in this folk tradition. Anyone could look up on a clear night and point out Cain's figure to children or newcomers, making him perhaps the most accessible biblical character in medieval culture. His story literally hung over every medieval community, visible reminder of humanity's capacity for evil and divine commitment to justice. Medieval Crusade literature introduced another geographical tradition that placed Cain's death in the Holy Land itself. According to various Crusader chronicles, there was a mountain near Jerusalem called Cain Mons, or Mount Cain, where the first murderer had finally met his end. These accounts typically described how Crusader armies discovered ancient ruins or caves that local tradition associated with Cain's final dwelling place. Some versions suggested that Cain had lived as a hermit in these mountains for centuries before dying of old age. Others claimed that he had been killed there by divine intervention or by one of his own descendants. The Mount Cain tradition served important ideological purposes for Crusader culture. It provided geographical specificity to biblical narrative, making the Holy Land seem more authentically connected to scriptural history. It also suggested that the land itself bore witness to divine justice. In SPS, the same region that had seen Christ's crucifixion had also witnessed the death of history's first murderer. Some Crusader accounts went further, claiming that Cain's death at Mount Cain had been a prefiguration of Christ's sacrifice. Just as the first murderer had died on a mountain in the Holy Land, so the ultimate Redeemer would die on a nearby hill centuries later. This typological reading transformed Cain's death from simple justice into prophetic anticipation of salvation. The geographical tradition also explained why the Holy Land had experienced so much violence throughout history. According to this folk theology, Cain's presence had somehow sanctified the region for both great evil and great redemption. The land that had drunk the blood of history's first murder victim would eventually drink the blood of history's ultimate sacrifice. Medieval Gnostic communities developed their own distinctive folklore around Cain that connected him not to the moon, but to the sun and its cycles of destruction and renewal. These traditions, preserved in various esoteric texts and oral traditions, presented Cain as a figure of cosmic rather than merely terrestrial significance. According to some Gnostic accounts, Cain's crime had disrupted the natural order so fundamentally that it affected the sun's movement across the sky. His murder of Abel was said to have introduced the concept of death into creation, which manifested cosmically as the daily death of the sun each evening and its resurrection each morning. More elaborate Gnostic traditions suggested that Cain himself had become associated with solar phenomena, NIT, specifically with solar eclipses, which were interpreted as moments when Cain's shadow passed across the face of the divine light. These events were seen as cosmic reenactments of his crime, temporary victories of darkness over light that served as warnings about the ongoing presence of evil in creation. The solar connection also linked Cain to seasonal cycles and agricultural festivals that remained important in medieval rural communities. Some folk traditions suggested that crop failures, droughts, or unseasonable weather were manifestations of Cain's ongoing curse affecting the earth's productivity. Conversely, particularly abundant harvests were seen as evidence that divine mercy was temporarily overcoming Cain's legacy. These Gnostic solar traditions influenced medieval alchemy and early scientific thinking about astronomical phenomena. The idea that human moral action could affect cosmic order provided a framework for understanding natural disasters, celestial events, and seasonal variations as morally meaningful rather than merely physical occurrences. Perhaps the most psychologically compelling medieval folk tradition was the belief that Cain remained alive, wandering the earth as an immortal figure encountered by various historical persons. These legends, which paralleled similar traditions about the wandering Jew, suggested that Cain's punishment included not just exile, but eternal life without the possibility of death's release. Medieval chronicles and travel accounts occasionally included stories of encounters with a mysterious figure who identified himself as Cain. These accounts typically described him as enormously tall, visibly marked by his ancient crime, and compelled to tell his story to anyone he met. Sometimes, he was said to appear at moments of particular historical significance, before battles, during plagues, or at the deaths of important rulers. The wandering tradition served several cultural functions. It provided a supernatural explanation for various unexplained phenomena, FDS, strange encounters in remote places, unsolved crimes, or mysterious warnings that saved communities from disaster. It also reinforced medieval understanding of divine justice as both patient and inexorable. X died. Cain's continuing life proved that God's mercy preserved even the worst sinners, while his eternal wandering demonstrated that some consequences could never be escaped. Some versions of the wandering tradition suggested that Cain was searching for something, to his brother's forgiveness, divine absolution, or simply the peace of death. These accounts transformed him from a figure of pure evil into someone whose crime had trapped him in a state of perpetual regret and seeking. This psychological complexity made him more sympathetic while maintaining his function as moral warning. Medieval folk magic incorporated Cain's story into various protective and binding rituals, treating his name and story as sources of supernatural power. These practices reveal how ordinary people understood the relationship between biblical narrative and magical efficacy. Some folk magic traditions used Cain's name in curses, invoking his example to call down divine judgment on enemies or wrongdoers. The logic was that since God had responded to Abel's murder with swift punishment, invoking Cain's precedent might prompt similar divine intervention against contemporary crimes. Conversely, other traditions used Cain's story for protection, reasoning that since God had protected Cain despite his crime, similar divine protection might be available to others who invoked his precedent. These practices often involve carrying written versions of Cain's story or reciting specific prayers that referenced his divine protection. the most sophisticated folk magic traditions attempted to harness what they saw as Cain's supernatural knowledge. Since he had lived for centuries and traveled extensively, he was believed to possess secret knowledge about hidden treasures, powerful herbs, or effective curses. Various grimoires and magical texts claim to preserve spells or formulas that Cain had supposedly developed during his wandering years. Medieval folklore transformed Cain from a biblical character into a living presence in popular culture. Whether visible in the moon, encountered on remote roads, or invoked in magical practices, he became part of the everyday medieval worldview in ways that purely theological treatments could never achieve. These folk traditions also democratized Cain's story, making it accessible to illiterate populations who might never hear formal biblical instruction. A peasant who couldn't read Genesis could still point to the moon and tell the story of the man with the bundle of sticks. A traveler could share legends about the wandering stranger who appeared at crossroads with warnings or prophecies. The medieval folk transformation of Cain reveals the remarkable human capacity to find meaning and moral instruction in the most basic elements of daily experience: the phases of the moon, the changing of seasons, unexpected encounters with strangers. By embedding his story in these universal human experiences, medieval folklore ensured that Cain's tale would continue to influence moral imagination long after the specific theological debates that shaped his earlier interpretations had been forgotten. The folk traditions also demonstrate how biblical narratives function not just as historical accounts, but as continuing stories that each generation retells in ways that address their own concerns and circumstances. Medieval Cain became a figure who spoke to medieval anxieties about violence, justice, wandering, and the possibility of redemption, while remaining recognizably connected to his biblical origins. Cain's story has proven irresistibly attractive to artists, writers, and creators across centuries, becoming one of the most frequently adapted biblical narratives in Western culture. From Renaissance masterpieces to modern vampire novels, his tale continues to provide a powerful framework for exploring themes of guilt, alienation, and the human capacity for both creation and destruction. The visual arts discovered in Cain's story, a perfect subject for exploring human emotion at its most extreme. Renaissance and Baroque painters found in the moment of Abel's discovery, whether the murder itself or its aftermath, opportunities to display technical mastery while engaging profound theological themes. William Blake's The Body of Abel, found by Adam and Eve, represents perhaps the most psychologically penetrating artistic treatment of Cain's story. Blake's composition places the viewer in the position of witnessing ultimate parental grief. Adam and Eve, discovering their son's corpse, while Cain flees in the background. The work captures not just the immediate tragedy, but its cosmic significance, with swirling clouds and dramatic lighting suggesting divine response to humanity's first murder. Blake's treatment is notable for its refusal to demonize Cain completely. Even as he flees, Blake's Cain appears more terrified than evil, more psychologically shattered than coldly calculating. This humanization of the first murderer reflects Romantic period interest in the complexity of human motivation and the possibility that evil might stem from psychological damage rather than inherent corruption. Friedrich Rehberg's series of drawings depicting Cain's story takes a different approach, focusing on the progression from offering to murder to curse. Rehberg's work emphasizes the agricultural context of the story, showing Cain as a working farmer whose identity becomes wrapped up in the success or failure of his crops. When divine rejection threatens that identity, violence becomes his psychological escape route. Caravaggio and other Baroque masters found in the murder scene itself opportunities to explore chiaroscuro, WT, the dramatic interplay of light and shadow that became their signature technique. These paintings typically show the moment of violence frozen in time, with divine light highlighting Abel's innocence while Cain's face remains partially obscured by shadow, suggesting his moral state through visual technique. Literature has proven even more adventurous than visual art in reimagining Cain's story for contemporary audiences. Writers have used his narrative framework to explore everything from vampire mythology to urban alienation to the psychology of serial killing. Charles Baudelaire's poem Abel and Cain transforms the biblical brothers into symbols of social class conflict, with Abel representing the wealthy and privileged, while Cain embodies the oppressed working class. Baudelaire's Cain becomes a revolutionary figure whose violence is justified by systemic inequality. This interpretation reflects 19th century concerns about industrialization and class warfare while maintaining the basic narrative structure of the original story. Lord Byron's dramatic poem, Cain, a Mystery, presents perhaps the most theologically radical literary treatment of the story. Byron's Cain is a philosophical rebel who questions divine justice and refuses to accept guilt for actions he believes were inevitable given his circumstances. Byron's version engages directly with Enlightenment critiques of traditional Christianity, using Cain as a mouthpiece for rational skepticism about divine benevolence. The poem caused enormous controversy upon publication, with critics condemning Byron for making Cain too sympathetic and God too arbitrary. But Byron's treatment influenced subsequent literary exploration of the story by establishing precedent for questioning traditional interpretations of divine justice and human responsibility. Modern literature has found in Cain's story a perfect framework for exploring contemporary anxieties about violence, alienation, and moral responsibility. John Steinbeck's East of Eden uses the Cain and Abel narrative as the organizing principle for a multi-generational family saga that explores how patterns of violence and rejection pass through bloodlines and social stand in John. Structures. Steinbeck's treatment is notable for its psychological sophistication and its refusal to accept simple moral categories. His Cain figures are neither purely evil nor completely innocent, but complex individuals whose choices emerge from the intersection of personal history, family dynamics, and social circumstance. Contemporary popular culture has embraced Cain's story with particular enthusiasm, finding in his narrative arc perfect material for horror, fantasy, and thriller genres. The transformation of Cain from biblical figure to pop culture icon reveals both the enduring power of his story and the creative freedom that modern media allows. Vampire literature has found Cain particularly useful as an origin figure. Various novels and television series have suggested that Cain's curse transformed him into the first vampire, condemned to drink blood for eternity as punishment for spilling his brother's blood. This interpretation connects biblical narrative to contemporary horror mythology while maintaining thematic coherence and calm. The punishment fits the crime in darkly poetic ways. The vampire interpretation also allows modern writers to explore themes of immortality, alienation, and moral corruption that resonate with contemporary audiences. A vampiric Cain becomes someone whose crime has trapped him in eternal existence without the possibility of redemption or release, making him simultaneously monster and tragic figure. Television and film have adapted Cain's story for everything from psychological thrillers to science fiction epics. These adaptations typically update the agricultural setting to contemporary contexts, STs, rival business partners, competing scientists, or feuding family members, while maintaining the basic dynamic of jealousy leading to violence. Video games have found Cain's story particularly adaptable to interactive media, where players can experience moral choice and consequence in ways that passive media cannot provide. Games that incorporate Cain's narrative often focus on the moment of decision, offering players the choice between violence and acceptance, between revenge and forgiveness. The visual storytelling possibilities of comic books and graphic novels have produced some of the most creative adaptations of Cain's story. These media allow creators to combine visual symbolism with narrative experimentation in ways that neither pure literature nor film can match. Neil Gaiman's Sandman series features Cain as a recurring character who embodies the principle of storytelling itself. Gaiman's Cain is condemned to eternal existence in the realm of dreams, where he tells stories that reveal hidden truths about human nature. This interpretation transforms his curse from simple punishment into cosmic function. He becomes the universe's designated narrator of humanity's darkest impulses. Other graphic novel treatments have placed Cain in contemporary urban settings, exploring how his ancient story might play out in modern contexts. These adaptations typically focus on themes of urban alienation, family dysfunction, and the cycle of violence that passes through generations. Classical and contemporary music have both found inspiration in Cain's story, though musical treatments tend to focus more on emotional and atmospheric elements than on narrative detail. Classical compositions inspired by Cain's story typically emphasize the dramatic contrast between innocence and violence, using musical techniques to represent the psychological transformation from jealousy to murder. These works often feature sharp dynamic contrasts, dissonant harmonies, and rhythmic patterns that suggest psychological turmoil. Contemporary popular music has found in Cain's story a perfect framework for exploring themes of family conflict, social alienation, and moral failure. Hip-hop artists in particular have embraced Cain as a symbol of how systemic inequality and lack of opportunity can drive individuals toward violence and self-destruction. One of the most unusual cultural appropriations of Cain's story appears in Charles Godfrey Leland's Aradia, or the Gospel of the Witches, which presents an alternative religious tradition that makes Cain a positive figure rather than a cautionary tale. In Leland's account, Cain represents rebellion against oppressive divine authority rather than criminal violence. This interpretation reflects late 19th century interest in alternative spiritualities and critiques of traditional Christianity. While scholars debate the authenticity of Leland's sources, his work demonstrates how Cain's story can be completely reinterpreted when removed from its original theological context. The persistence of Cain's story in popular culture reveals its continuing relevance to contemporary concerns about violence, justice, and human nature. Modern adaptations typically focus on psychological rather than theological aspects of his story, using it to explore mental health, family dysfunction, and social inequality. The story's emphasis on sibling rivalry resonates particularly strongly in contemporary culture, where family relationships are increasingly understood through psychological rather than merely moral frameworks. Modern treatments of Cain often present him as someone whose crime resulted from untreated mental health issues, childhood trauma, or social disadvantage rather than simple moral corruption. Yet even these secularized interpretations maintain the story's essential moral weight. Whether presented as vampire origin myth or psychological case study, Cain's story continues to serve as a warning about the human capacity for violence and the importance of choosing constructive responses to disappointment and rejection. The remarkable adaptability of Cain's story across media and genres suggests that it addresses fundamental aspects of human experience that transcend specific cultural or religious contexts. His tale continues to provide a powerful framework for exploring questions about justice, mercy, family, violence, and redemption that every generation must answer for itself. Cain's story operates on multiple philosophical levels simultaneously, functioning as both historical narrative and symbolic framework for understanding fundamental questions about human nature, moral responsibility, and the origins of violence. Across 4 millennia, philosophers, theologians, and psychologists have found in his tale a concentrated exploration of issues that continue to challenge human understanding. At its most basic philosophical level, Cain's story addresses the question that has puzzled thinkers since the beginning of recorded history: where does evil come from? If humans were created good, as Genesis suggests, how do we account for the presence of violence, hatred, and moral corruption in human experience? Cain represents humanity's first encounter with what philosophers call moral evil, harm caused not by natural disasters or accidents, but by deliberate human choice. His crime establishes that evil isn't something external that happens to humans, but something internal that emerges from human decision-making processes. The story's philosophical power lies in its refusal to provide easy answers about evil's ultimate source. Cain's offering was rejected, but the text doesn't explain why. His anger was acknowledged by God, but not condemned. His choice to murder was preceded by divine warning that he could still do well if he chose differently. The narrative suggests that evil emerges from the complex interaction of circumstance, emotion, and choice, rather than from any single determining factor. This ambiguity has made Cain's story a touchstone for philosophical debates about determinism versus free will. Those who emphasize human freedom point to God's warning that Cain could still choose righteousness. Those who stress determining factors note that Cain's rejection by God created circumstances that made violence more likely, even if not inevitable. Modern psychology has found in Cain's story a perfect case study for understanding how competition for parental attention can escalate into life-threatening violence. The dynamic between Cain and Abel illuminates psychological patterns that continue to play out in families, organizations, and societies. Cain's rage wasn't primarily about religious failure, but about comparative success. Abel's acceptance by God meant that Cain was not just unsuccessful, but demonstrably inferior to his brother. This comparative dimension transforms simple disappointment into existential threat. Cain's identity as the competent older brother was shattered by evidence that his younger sibling was more favored by the ultimate authority figure. The psychological term, narcissistic injury, describes the specific type of emotional wound that occurs when someone's grandiose self-image is contradicted by reality. Cain's story provides perhaps history's first literary exploration of how such injuries can motivate extreme violence when individuals lack healthy coping mechanisms. The story also illuminates how shame can transform into rage when individuals feel unable to admit or address their failures. Rather than examining why his offering was rejected, Cain channeled his emotional energy into eliminating the person whose success highlighted his inadequacy. This psychological dynamic continues to drive everything from workplace violence to international conflicts. Cain's dual role as history's first murderer and first city builder presents a philosophical paradox that has influenced thinking about human progress for millennia. How can the same impulses that drive individuals toward violence also motivate the cooperative achievements that make civilization possible? The story suggests that human creativity and human destructiveness may spring from the same psychological sources. Cain's inability to accept divine judgment led him both to murder his brother and to pioneer urban planning. His rejection of dependence on natural agricultural cycles drove him both to violence and to technological innovation. This paradox has profound implications for understanding human progress. If civilization emerges partly from humanity's refusal to accept natural limitations, FSA, the same impulse that motivated Cain's crime, then human achievement may be inherently morally ambiguous. The cities, technologies, and institutions that protect and enhance human life may also concentrate and amplify human capacity for violence and oppression. Philosophers from Augustine to Hannah Arendt have wrestled with this civilization paradox, recognizing that human society's greatest achievements often emerge from the same impulses that drive its greatest failures. Cain's story provides the archetypal example of how creativity and destructiveness intertwine in human motivation. Cain's story raises uncomfortable questions about divine justice that continue to challenge religious and philosophical thinking. Why was Abel's offering accepted while Cain's was rejected? Was this divine choice arbitrary or based on criteria that Cain could have discovered and met? How do we reconcile divine omniscience with human moral responsibility? The narrative's silence about why God preferred Abel's offering has generated centuries of speculation, but perhaps the silence itself is philosophically significant. If divine approval could be earned through specific techniques or attitudes, religion would become mere technology, a set of procedures for manipulating divine response. The mystery of God's choice preserves the relationship as genuinely personal rather than merely transactional. Yet this divine freedom creates philosophical problems about fairness and moral responsibility. If Cain couldn't know what would make his offering acceptable, how can he be held responsible for its rejection? The story seems to suggest that divine relationship involves elements that transcend human control or understanding, making religious life inherently uncertain and requiring faith rather than merely knowledge. Perhaps the most enduring philosophical question raised by Cain's story concerns the extent and limits of human moral responsibility. The famous question, "Am I my brother's keeper?" has become humanity's perpetual challenge about our obligations to other people. Cain's question was meant as a denial of responsibility, but it inadvertently articulated one of ethics' central issues. What do we owe to other people, and why? The story implies that human beings have obligations to each other that extend beyond legal requirements or explicit agreements. Family relationships create moral bonds that can't be dissolved by individual choice. But the story also raises questions about the limits of such responsibility. Was Cain actually responsible for Abel's welfare, or was each brother responsible only for his own choices? Modern discussions about everything from social welfare to international intervention often return to this fundamental question about how far our obligations to others extend. The story's treatment of responsibility also illuminates the relationship between individual choice and social context. Cain's crime emerged from his personal decisions, but those decisions were influenced by divine action, family dynamics, and cultural circumstances. This complexity continues to challenge legal and moral thinking about how to balance individual accountability with recognition of determining factors beyond personal control. Ultimately, Cain's story functions as philosophy's first systematic exploration of how quickly human dignity can collapse into human monstrosity. His transformation from disappointed worshiper to fratricidal killer illustrates how moral failure typically progresses through recognizable stages: disappointment, comparison, resentment, dehumanization, and finally violence. The story's enduring relevance lies in its demonstration that ordinary human emotions, jealousy, disappointment, anger, can escalate into extraordinary evil when they're not addressed constructively. Cain wasn't a monster. He was a human being who made destructive choices in response to challenging circumstances. This recognition makes his story both more disturbing and more hopeful than interpretations that treat him as simply evil. More disturbing because it suggests that the capacity for extreme violence exists in ordinary human psychology. More hopeful because it implies that different choices could have produced different outcomes, even after his offering was rejected. Cain's philosophical legacy thus serves as both warning and invitation. Warning about how quickly moral failure can escalate, but invitation to examine our own responses to disappointment, rejection, and comparative failure before they harden into patterns that lead toward violence and destruction. After examining Cain's story through biblical narrative, religious interpretation, cultural adaptation, and philosophical analysis, we're left with a figure who somehow manages to be both completely familiar and eternally mysterious. 4,000 years of human reflection have illuminated many aspects of his tale, while leaving its deepest questions not just unanswered, but perhaps unanswerable. Cain's story reveals humanity at its darkest and most complex: jealousy, violence, divine mercy, and eternal wandering. His legacy haunts us still, asking whether we'll choose his path or something better. Thanks for joining us on this journey through history's first crime. See you in the next video.